argued that he had immunity from the DOJ's suit against him because, quote, the action was barred by the speech or debate clause, end quote, and separately because, quote, the separation of powers doctrine barred the DOJ from suing him, end quote, when a congressional committee had already investigated him. Id at 185, we held that the latter claim falls within the collateral order doctrine, quote, recognizing claims of immunity based on the separation of powers doctrine as an additional exception to the general rule against interlocutory appeals, end quote. Id, granted, we acknowledged that the separation of powers doctrine, quote, does not provide as precise a protection as the speech or debate clause, end quote. But we focused on the, quote, equivalent reasons for vindicating in advance of trial whatever protection it affords, end quote. Id at 186, quotation omitted. We confirmed Rose's applicability in the criminal context in United States v. Durenberger, 48 F3D 1239, D.C. Circuit 1995. There, former Senator Durenberger sought to dismiss an indictment, arguing, based on separation of powers, that the district court was powerless to decide whether he had violated the Senate's rules, a prerequisite of its assessment of criminal charges against him. See id at 1241, U.S. Constitution, Article 1, 5, Clause 2, quote, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, end quote. He thus, quote, claimed that as a former member of the Senate, he cannot be held to answer criminal charges when his liability depends on judicial usurpation of the Senate's exclusive right to formulate its internal rules, end quote. Durenberger 48F 3D at 1242. We held that this, quote, colorable, end quote, argument was sufficient to confer appellate jurisdiction under Rose. Id. Notably, the constitutional text invoked in Durenberger can hardly be said to create an, quote, explicit, end quote, right not to stand trial. As we explained in subsequent case, both Rose and Durenberger rest on the rationale that the, quote, separation of powers doctrine conferred an analogous and comparable,